Alana Siegel is going to be sharing a very special recipe that her mother started making many, many years ago, and she'll give you a little bit more detail about that. So it's a family recipe that they've passed down, and it sounds delicious. I can't wait to see what it looks like. I wish we could taste it, but I think seeing it on screen will encourage me to actually make it on my own. And so again, please ask questions. We want this to be interactive. So if something comes up, use the chat feature to send a question and I'll be monitoring any questions. So we're expecting this class to go for an hour. Let us know if you need anything in that hour. And Alana, you're all set.
Thank you, Nina. Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. As those of you know who saw the Instagram posts, we're making a Murbatide blueberry pie. It's not a regular sort of American style blueberry pie. It's a German style blueberry pie. The crust is a short crust. That's what Murbatide means in German, which means it's a richer dough. It's a bit more like a cookie consistency than a flaky American pie dough. So Nina mentioned that this is a recipe that my mom invented. She's an amazing cook and baker, and I learned all I know about cooking and baking from her. And she was a big fan of the joy of cooking early on, as many cooks of that generation were. And there was a Murbatide cherry pie that was in one of the very old Joy of Cooking cookbooks. It's even not in the one I have, which I have one that's from the 70s. So it's in an earlier one than that, I believe. And it was made with canned cherries. So my mom would make this amazing German cherry pie with canned cherries, and you had to use the cherries and you had to use the syrup that was in the can as part of the recipe. But as time went on and we became more conscious of eating more kind of co-op style, I would call it, and using local and fresh produce, stopped using canned cherries but wanted to make the pie. So, and it was before the days when you could easily access actually sour cherries, which were the kind of cherries you needed for pie. So she invented a blueberry pie version, and she created puree that mimicked the syrup that was in the can. So I'm going to show you how to do all of that. And one of the things I like to emphasize is that I think people get nervous about pie because they're worried that it has to be perfect. And I'm going to show you it does not have to be perfect, and it's still delicious. So the first thing I'm going to do, and I'm going to be plugging some co-op products because everything I'm using is from them. So the co-op has a couple of different kinds of local blueberries right now. The ones I'm using tonight are the Grindstone Farm, but there's also an open fiber kind that you can use as well. I recommend using the freshest ones. So this here in the colander is 2 pints of berries. So it's about 4 cups that I've already washed and drained, and you have to sort of pick them over to make sure you get the stems off. These don't seem to have many stems, so I'm okay. You don't want a lot of extra water in the pie because it'll make it too soupy. So these berries are ready to go, and I'm doing the berries first because they have to sit for a while we make the crust. So the berries are here, and then you add in 10 tablespoons of sugar over the berries. And you kind of shake that around, let it mix in, and then we're gonna let that sit while we make the crust. It doesn't have to be an exact amount of time, but you'll start to see some juices start to form in the bowl. Okay, so the recipe for the crust has some sort of 70s aspects to it too. Namely, that usually you don't sift flour for a crust, but you sift this flour actually twice. So this is 3 cups of sifted flour that I sifted earlier, and I just wanted to show you, this is the co-op flour that I usually buy if they have it. It's the King Arthur. You can use one of the other ones, but I like the King Arthur a lot. Okay.
Alana, we have a question from the audience.
Okay.
Somebody asked, is it possible to use less sugar or a sugar alternative?
I suppose you could use, I think I've made a pie before, not this one with maple sugar. It will change the taste of it. I think it'll give it that more mapley accent. You could definitely use less sugar. This is 10 tablespoons because it's a lot of berries, but you could definitely cut back on it. There's going to be a little bit more sugar in the pie. If you use honey or agave, it's gonna change, I think, the taste of the pie a bit. It'll still be good. It'll just be different and maybe less European tasting, which is sort of what this pie is. Okay, so this is what I like to use to sift. I don't use, this is something I also learned from my mom. I do not use the kind of flour sifter that you pump. I don't find those work as well, and also usually their mesh is wider, so it doesn't sift as well. So I'm gonna re-sift this flour. It's already been sifted once, like I said, and I'm gonna just spoon it in here and re-sift it. You can see it's just getting more aerated. I brought this container out for the flour because it's also from the co-op. So you can get your ingredients and your tools at the Park Slope Food Co-op. Okay, so.
And Alana, is it important to sift twice or is
Yes.
one sufficient?
You should really sift it twice. They
Okay.
used to sell, and I don't think we do in the co-op, pre-sifted flour, and I think sometimes people would substitute that for the first sift, but I like to sift it. It's a kind of a heavy dough, so the more air, the better. This is 3/4 cup of sugar. It's a lot of sugar for a pie crust, and normal American pie crust might have a tablespoon of sugar, maybe even a 1/4 cup of sugar, but this is a lot of sugar because, like I said, it is more along the lines of a cookie dough rather than a pie dough. It also has a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, which I'm also sifting in. And this sift is pretty important because the sugar has a lot of rocks. So you have to kind of smooth it out and get it all through the mesh. So then the butter is going to be the next thing. It has 2 cups of butter. The butter has to be cold, as it always does for a pie dough. And I have already cut up the 2 sticks of butter. I use the Kate's unsalted. That's my go-to butter for pie crusts at the co-ops. And I'm still working on getting these lumps through.
Alana, have you ever used Vermont, the French butter with the high butter fat? And is there a particular reason why you've chosen Kate's?
So I like the Kate's for pies. I use the European butters, like the high fat butter, for cakes, especially for butter cakes, because that butter flavor comes through a lot. This dough is really rich already, so I wouldn't recommend adding more fat to it with the high fat butter. Okay, I'm getting it down so that it's not totally going through, as you can see. And in a minute, I'm gonna say it's okay to go.
Alana, have you ever tried this with gluten-free flour?
I knew that question was gonna come. I haven't, but I think that it would work with the cup for cup because everything I've ever tried with cup for cup works. Okay, so now I have the salt, the sugar, and the flour in here. My hands are clean. and I'm gonna use them. You can cut the butter in. When I make a regular pie crust, American style pie crust, I use the food processor usually. But with this pie dough, I'm gonna need the food processor later to make the syrup substitute. So I'm not using it, and I also like it a little bit better when you do it by hand. You can use the pastry cutter and cut the butter in. The idea is you don't want to overhandle the dough, and you also want the butter to end up not thoroughly mixed in. So for example, you wouldn't use an electric mixer for it. You want the butter in the end to be the size of peas. I like to do it with my hands because the pastry cutter takes a long time. It can get frustrating. And the warmth from your hands a little bit will help mix the butter in, but not over mix it. So it's a little bit of a cheat in that sense. So I'm just gonna break down. I'm trying to get the butter small enough. Again, you're not trying to make this perfect, so you're not trying to get every single piece of butter to a uniform size. It doesn't matter that much. And if you end up with a piece that's too big later on, you'll have another chance to smash it down. So don't get too fussed about that. So usually the next step in a pie crust after you do this is to use ice cold water. This pie dough, instead of using water as the element to bring it together, uses eggs. So I'm gonna just work on this. It's gonna take me a minute, so it's a good time if people have questions. You can also look at how, if we can turn the camera and you can see that the sugars in the blueberry is starting to sort of melt into them, which is nice. It's what we want. I'm also gonna be working with the dough by hand. You see I have a rolling pin here, but the rolling pin, I'll show you, we're not gonna actually roll the dough, we're gonna use it to make the top. Especially in the summer when it's hot, which is my favorite time to make pies because there's so much great fruit. It's important to have your butter very cold because it gets soft very quickly, even if you just take it out a few minutes before.
And Alana, somebody's asking how much flour? Was it 2 cups of flour that we have?
3 cups.
Okay, thank you.
And you sift it, you sift 3 cups of flour. It's not after the sift that you measure. In cakes, you often do the measurement after the sift, but you just start with 3 cups and then start with the sifting. Okay, the butter is getting to the right stage at this point. You can see that we're getting sort of pea sizes in the butter here. Okay, and instead of the water, again, I'm going to use eggs, and it's 2 eggs. And I do them separately because you want to beat them pretty well before you put them in.
And Alana, are those just regular large eggs?
Yeah, they're the regular large eggs from the co-op.
Great.
I personally like the white eggs, but you can use whichever ones you want. Okay, so you can see it's pretty well mixed there. I'm gonna give the dough one more. Okay, so now I'm gonna pour the egg over the mixture. And then, as my mom puts it, you wade in with your hands and you start working with the dough. You want it to come together, but you don't want to go on too much after that. You don't want it to become Play-Doh. And it takes a minute because you got to get the egg thoroughly mixed in. It's to get it to start to turn into a dough.
Alana, do you think you can use gloves for this, or do you think it really really need your hand texture of your hands?
I think gloves would be okay, although I would be worried that the plastic of those gloves might impart a smell.
Okay.
You can, I mean, you can use the pastry cutter if you like that better, or you can use 2 knives. I don't, and also you could use the food processor if you wanted, if you really don't want to use your hands. Okay, as you can see, the dough has now kind of come together. It's a little bit scraggy, so it's not smooth. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna form it into 2 kind of balls. Again, they don't have to be perfect. Because this is a lattice top pie, the top crust was gonna require a bit less dough than the bottom, so you can make one of your balls a bit bigger than the other one. So you can see at this stage, if you still feel like some of your butter is not sufficiently broken down into bits, you can pull it apart here. Okay, so now you have your dough. You see it doesn't look smooth. Work it a little bit more till it gets to kind of where it's sort of sticking together a bit. And there's your dough. Okay, now you're gonna refrigerate your dough for a couple of hours. You can do it overnight. I don't usually do it overnight. I usually do it for about 2 hours. And then you work with it after that. So I'm gonna put this aside now because this class is only an hour, so we're not gonna wait for the dough. We are gonna, use the dough that I made earlier. So this is the dough I made earlier. And I'm going to put it into the pan. And I'm not gonna clean my hands yet because I'm about to use them again. So I like to use a glass pan for this. And I like to go up the sides first with the dough. You'll see when you make this, which I hope that you do, that it has a kind of a spably texture to it because of the sugar. You can feel the sugar in the dough, which is gonna give it that kind of cookie-like consistency at the end. Again, this doesn't have to be perfect, but you do want to get it sort of even around so that it bakes evenly. Most glass pie dishes have this lip on the edge. I go up to the edge, but I don't go over the lip, only because when you cut it, it will break at that point for every slice, so it won't look that pretty. So as you can see, I'm just patting this in. I'm trying to cover the pan well, and then I'll go back and make any corrections if I'm missing spots or whatever. If any of you saw some of the videos I posted of American pie crust, You can all, that kind of pie crust, which you do roll out, is also quite forgiving. And you can also, with that sort of pie crust, if you make a mistake or you're missing part in a section, you can break off and add. No one will know the difference when the pie comes out of the oven. You won't be able to tell. So I use the heel of my hand to kind of smooth out the bottom. And I'm going up the sides a little bit. I feel like this part is a little thinner over here. So I'm gonna add some more here, push this part back up. And as you can see, I'm not going over the rim, but I am going kind of up a little bit past the rim on the side of the pan. And you want to push it down because you want to make sure there's plenty of room for the fruit. So after I have it pushed up like this, I like to take a knife, just a small paring knife, and I like to just kind of clean it around this edge. I don't know that it matters so much, but it makes the pie a little bit neater when you do it that way. So you're up to the rim and you're just kind of trimming off this little bit of excess around here. Now this dough I did make earlier today, but I also took it out of the refrigerator about an hour ago. So it has chilled. It's much colder than the one that I just made, obviously, but it is not rock hard. So I can still work with it. So you see that's, and I just might throw this down here. So this is the pie crust. Now, this is the bottom. Now I'm gonna make the top, and I'm gonna do it now before we get to the fruit because I want to make sure that I have time to refrigerate it. Plus my hands are already covered in dough, so it's a good time to do it. So this is the other half. And what I'm gonna do is, now you can't roll this dough because it is just too soft to roll. So to make the lattice top, I'm gonna take pieces and I wanna end up with ideally 10 pieces, 10 lines, I guess I'll call them, that you form with your hands. And I just make these kind of logs like this. Now, of course, because it's a circle, going across a circle, there are different lengths at different points. But again, it's pretty forgiving, so I'm not going to worry too much. I'm going to make sure I have some that are long-ish, and then if some break, I know I'll use those on the edge. So you see that just broke when I was doing it. It is a little bit, you know, I don't want the dough to be so hard that I can't work with it, but I also don't want it to be too soft. I left the flour out in case I wanted to use that, but I think the parchment does a pretty good job of helping the dough not stick. So I'm up to 4. I'm not going to want them to be too wide either because you want to create some space.
Alana, when you have made American pie crusts, have you ever used the vodka method, using vodka rather than water?
I have not used the vodka method. I have used cider vinegar. I don't love the taste as much, but I know people like it. I would try it sometime. I just haven't. I usually do an all butter crust. Sometimes I'll use the vegetable shortening that the Co-op has, the kind of healthier form of Crisco, but I haven't ever used vodka. Okay. I'm just gonna try to, as I roll them out a little bit more. You can also see why I didn't want to overwork the dough initially, because I got my hands in here a lot. If you're gonna do something with an American pie crust, I would strongly recommend going to the food co-op and getting the sour cherries, which are still in season. It's been a little bit longer season, I think, than usual this year, because they're still in there. It's been a few weeks, and they do make amazing pies. And actually, because this was originally a cherry pie recipe, we're gonna use almond extract in it, because that's often used in cherry pies. It brings out the flavor of the fruit nicely, and it doesn't overwhelm. You can see, by the way, that I'm doing this on a cutting board. Just think it makes it a little easier, makes the cleanup easier. This is, in a weird way, although this recipe for dough is a little more foolproof, and I think it scares people less because you don't have to roll it. It is a little bit more time consuming just because you have to do all these pieces by hand, as opposed to being able to just roll them out and cut them.
It looks so good. I am a huge fan of shortbread.
That's what it tastes like.
Oh, I wish I could have some.
I wish you all could smell it too, because it smells so good in here. So I'm not gonna worry too much if I end up with 8 or 10. I like 10 because it's nice to have an odd number going both ways on the pie. So 5, I like 5 and 5, if I can get that many out of it. The other kind of pie that I will use this crust for is an open face peach pie. You can make, I can share that recipe too later on the website, but I do use this kind of crust, and I'll make a half recipe of it and put it into the bottom just like this, and then you cut fresh peaches, peeled or unpeeled, and then you make a custard with melted butter, sugar, some milk, some vanilla, and you pour it over it and bake it. It makes a really great peach pie. And the peaches, when it's open face, you kind of, sometimes I think a closed top peach pie gets a little bit, the fruit can get a little bit lost in there, just because the amount of time that you have to bake the pie to get the crust right is a lot of time for the peaches to be in the oven. But when it's open face like that and there's only one bottom crust, it's nice. Okay, so now I've got my logs. So I have 9. I'm gonna get a 10th one here, you'll see. So what I do now is I put this parchment paper, which by the way is not from the co-op. You can get parchment paper at the co-op, but I like these pre-cut pieces. So I put a piece on top, and then I just am using this to flatten. I'm not really rolling. I'm just flattening the logs out. You can do it by hand. You can just push them down with your hand, but I find this is pretty easy. And with the parchment paper, it doesn't stick. Okay. Now I have my pieces. And I'm gonna leave those for now, because now we need to return to working on the fruit. So I'm just gonna rinse my hands really quickly. And it's been the right amount of time for the blueberries to kind of be sitting. I'm just gonna give them a quick stir to make sure that the sugar is kind of getting distributed all through. And now I'm going to make the syrup. I've washed and drained another pint of blueberries, and I'm gonna put this into the food processor. And I have here 2 tablespoons of sugar. You know, when you're sweetening a pie, it obviously depends a lot on how good your fruit is or how sweet your fruit is. So this is 2 tablespoons. I think it's about the right amount. But you could do a little less for the person who is asking about less sugar. I think a little less sugar in this part would probably be okay. So now I'm gonna, this is my favorite part because it makes such a beautiful color. So I really want to get it pureed. So you can see it's a really pretty color. It's pureed. You still see a little bit of the skin, which is fine. And then I add a 1/4 cup of water, and that's just gonna thin it out a bit. Again, we're just trying to mimic that syrup that's in a jar of cherries. Okay, so
Alana, if you don't
Yes.
have a food processor, do you think this would work with an immersion blender?
I think it would. I think you would make sure that you're not wearing anything that you don't want to get stained, because I think the blueberries probably jump out at you. But yes, I think you could use an immersion blender, or you could use a regular blender. You could definitely also do this in one of those mini food processors, which are inexpensive and easy to find.
And what about just the Vitamix or a regular?
Yeah, I think you could definitely use a Vitamix. You could definitely use that. I prefer a food processor myself, but you can definitely use the Vitamix.
And why do you prefer it? Just for us to understand it.
I think that the Vitamix, when it doesn't have much liquid in it, it's trouble, because you have to keep kind of stirring up the bottom, because the blade's all the way at the bottom.
Yeah.
And your stuff is up higher than the blade, so you keep having to rotate it through. And the food processor just, I find it's a little bit easier because the blade is going out.
Okay. That makes sense.
Okay, now what I'm gonna do is use my Pyrex cup, which is also from the food co-op, and I'm gonna reserve a 1/4 cup of the puree. So that's about a 1/4 cup. And I'm gonna put the rest into this saucepan. So you can see the color is really pretty, but it's not completely smooth. You still see a little bit of the pieces of the berry in there. Okay, now into the cup, the Pyrex that I have the 1/4 cup of puree, I'm adding 4 teaspoons of cornstarch. This is the thickener. I've never tried this with tapioca or flour, which are other thickeners people use with pie. I think the cornstarch works well. And I'm gonna mix it up. I don't want any lumps in there, so I use a whisk. And I want to make sure I get all that cornstarch, because this is the thing that's gonna make this into a pie actually, and not just a crust with fruit running around with no consistency. Okay, so then I take the portion that does not have the cornstarch in it, and I put it over heat. And what I'm gonna do, I have it on a pretty high heat because I'm boiling it. And we're gonna bring the camera over and show you how it develops. So you don't have to stir it continuously or anything, but you're waiting for it to boil, because when it boils, I'm gonna add the cornstarch mixture. While I'm waiting for that to boil, I'm just gonna add my blueberries into the shell, because they've been sitting long enough. They go right in. There's excess sugar in this bowl, so I'm gonna try to get it in there. It's gonna all melt in the oven, so it doesn't have to be perfectly distributed. It smells so good because the berries have so much flavor. And certainly, again, for the person who asked, if you don't like things sweet, or if you're trying to not use as much white sugar, you could definitely use a little less. Okay, back to our puree. It's boiling. So it's boiling. So now that it's boiling, I'm gonna add my cornstarch mixture in. I want to make sure I get it all, because I want to get that 4 teaspoons of cornstarch into the mix. And I whisk that through. And if you can see by the color, it's become cloudy now because of the white cornstarch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cook it until it starts to shine a bit more. Again, you see it's already starting to shine a little bit more. It's not long. You can see, I hope you can through the camera, it's starting to clear. And I can feel it with the whisk that it's gotten thicker. So I'm going to turn it off and put it to the side.
Alana, somebody has a great question. Is there a reason why we wait to add the cold slurry to the hot liquid?
To add the what?
So is there a reason why you set aside the 1/4 cup of the cornstarch, blueberry mixture, and then you waited till the blueberry on the stove heated up before you added it? Is there a reason?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Usually when you're adding a thickening agent like that, you dilute it in a small amount, and then it distributes better in the pot. It might not be totally necessary in this case, but it works well. So one quick extra step. So I think it's good. Now, one interesting thing about this is that you don't have to cool this syrup. I don't want it to be totally burning hot, but it doesn't have to cool down. I'm just gonna give it a minute while I'm working with the crust a bit more. So because it's warm and it's July, the dough's getting a little soft, so I might end up putting it back in the fridge. But you see now, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make these look a bit neater by cutting them. Cutting off sort of the rougher edges. The whole thing gets a bit melty in the oven anyway, so again, if you don't want to do this extra step, you don't need to. But I'm just gonna make my strips a little bit finer edged. And this is another reason I like to use the cutting board, because it makes this part easier. Okay. So now I'm gonna see how I'm doing on whether they are gonna be cooperative in getting off of this parchment. I like using a knife, so you can see it's moving a bit, but it's still gonna come off. So I think I'm okay. But if it's very hot in your kitchen, you might at this point put it back in the fridge just like this for a few minutes. I'm gonna end up needing these extra bits here to make another strip or two. So I'm gonna take those off. And again, it doesn't need to be, as you can see, they're not all exactly the same size. It has a bit of a rustic look, and that's part of it. So it doesn't need to be perfect. Sometimes I think when people worry too much with baking about making it perfect, then they just don't do it because it seems too intimidating. And if I felt like it had to be perfect, I wouldn't want to do it either so much. So I got another piece out of that. Okay. So now I'm gonna pour the hot syrup. Because it's warm and because it's hot, I think I am gonna maybe put this in the fridge for a minute because the hot syrup is gonna make everything warmer. I'm gonna roll out my other piece here. Wish you could touch the dough because I can feel the sugar because it's got that high sugar content. So here's the pie crust with the berries in it. I'm gonna give this one more second to cool off. And then I'm gonna I add a 1/4 teaspoon of either almond or vanilla. I'm gonna do the almonds. You can do vanilla if there's an allergy or if you don't like the almond, but because it is just a 1/4 teaspoon, it doesn't add, it just gives it a little bit of a accent. It doesn't really change the flavor significantly, but I would add vanilla if you don't want to use the almond. Okay, so now I'm gonna pour the syrup from the pan onto the
That looks absolutely incredible.
So again, you can imagine in the 1970s version that this was a sticky, corn syrupy, loopy mess that actually tasted good to our palates then, but probably wouldn't as much now. So that's what it looks like. And it is still hot. So I'm gonna give those strips another minute just because it's summer and I don't want to put them directly on while it's still super hot. So I'm gonna give it another minute. If people have questions, I'm gonna give it a minute to cool down a little bit before I put the strips over it.
Lana, have you tried this recipe with strawberries?
I've never tried it with strawberries. I don't love the taste of cooked strawberries. I think it would probably work, but I think when you cook the strawberries, again, for the length of time, this needs to be in the oven for at least 50 minutes. Maybe closer to 60. That's a lot of time to cook strawberries. I would do it with cherries, but I think that the sour cherries are so precious to me that I usually just never want to use them for anything except a straight up sour cherry pie, just because there's so much work to pit, and then you don't have that many pies that you can get out of the season. So I usually just do a regular cherry pie. But actually, when I do cherry pie, I'm glad you asked that, Nina, because I wanted to mention when I do a cherry pie, I usually cook the filling the night before and refrigerate it so that it's cold going in. I find that if you put the cherries in raw, that there's just so much water in them and so much juice, and you don't want to get rid of that, but it makes it hard for the pie to set up. So I found that if I do, usually for a cherry pie, I'll do the crust, and then I'll do 4 cups of cherries. And by the way, if you are freezing them, I showed how to do that on the Instagram. If you do freeze the cherries, for some reason that maybe somebody on the Zoom knows better than I, when you take them out of the freezer, there are fewer cups in the jar than there were when you put them in. They shrink down in the freezer. So usually you need kind of 6-7 cups of frozen cherries to get to 4 cups of cherries after the fact. But I cook the cherries with sugar and cornstarch and a little bit of almond extract in a saucepan until you get this kind of thickening syrup again in the cherries, and then I'll refrigerate that till it's cold and put that into a raw pie crust and cover that. Okay, I think we can do the strips now. So I'm gonna take kind of one of my longer ones first, because I want to make sure that I get the long part covered. If I were making this with regular pie crust, I would leave the pie crust. So I would do, I would lay the strips this way, pull them back, and then I would weave under, over, under, over. This dough does not want to move that way. So I just lay it on. So there's one, and I'm just gonna kind of attach it. And you see I have some extra here. I'm gonna get rid of it. I might need it to make another strip. We'll see. I don't think I would pick these up with my hand. Maybe if it weren't warm, but it needs, oh, this one's coming. That's because I put it back in the fridge. So I'm gonna put this way, so I make sure I get the diameter. And then I'm just kind of pinching it to the side. You see, I just want to point out that this one broke a little bit. It does not matter at all. It's going to melt together in the oven. Okay. So now, so I'm not leaving, but since I'm going back and forth, it's going to give a little bit of that effect. And as you can see, I didn't really plan. I just kind of rolled them to where I could get them to, and now I'm just taking the ones that look the longest to go across the middle of the pie. Okay, I just want you to see that this one's like not quite making it. I just push it, it's fine. Just putting the dough back in the fridge for that few minutes really made a difference in the consistency, I'll just tell you. And if you're worried about it, you could put it in for longer. It'll make it even easier to work with. So you can see it's getting a bit of that over under kind of feel to it, even though I'm not doing that over under. So I'm up to 6. By the way, my oven is preheating to 350 while I'm doing this. Usually with a regular American style pie, you cook it at a very high heat. But this one you don't.
Alana, someone mentioned that Concord grapes might be really good in that pie.
Oh yeah, that would be great. I've never actually baked with Concord grapes, but I bet you that would be delicious. And I bet you that it would make a beautiful puree too.
Have you ever thought of adding a little bit of salt to this recipe?
Well, there's salt in the dough. And
Oh,
you know
that's
what I find is that older recipes do not have as much salt as we use now. So I definitely could see adding salt. I don't miss it. But I could imagine that if this recipe were being created today, it would have salt. So you can see this one's getting too soft. So I'm gonna use this one and I'm gonna re-roll these other ones.
So Alana, just for a time check, it's 8:25.
Perfect. Okay. Excellent. So I feel like I could use one more. So I'm gonna make one more. I said 10, but I feel like the way I laid them out, well, maybe we'll see if we can get 2 more on. I don't like to get them too close together either. So as you can see, it's pretty forgiving. This dough that kind of got too soft, I'm just redoing it. You could not do this with regular pie crust. It would end up being very tough at the end when it came out. So I'm just gonna do 2 more. Also, because there's so much sugar in the dough, I don't do sugar on the top of this. If it were a regular American pie dough, I would probably put brush it with milk on the top and put some sugar on to get kind of a crisp top, but this doesn't need that. Okay, so I got one more here. And again, just kind of. And you know, I'm not measuring, I'm not trying to make all of these the exact same width. If you like to do that, I'm sure it would be great, but it's definitely not necessary. I'm just kind of eyeballing. And then I might go around and just kind of make sure I kept my clean edge there. And again, I don't want it to go over the lip because it'll break when I cut it. So there's the pie. It's ready to go in the oven. And by the miracle of science or the internet or something, it's going to bake very quickly right before your eyes. So here it is, baked. So you can see I let it get pretty brown around the edge. It was in, this one was in for 55 minutes. You can either use, you definitely want to put something under it. So if you're lucky enough to have one of these, I cannot find them anymore, but I love this drip catcher. You can sit the pie on top of it to bake it like this. If you don't have one of those, you can put a piece of parchment paper on a cookie sheet and bake it like that. But you definitely want to, as you can see from the side of this pan, there were drips. So that's the pie. I like to serve this pie with ice cream, with vanilla ice cream. It doesn't need ice cream if you're not an ice cream fan because it is so rich, but I like to put a little vanilla ice cream with it. Co-op has so many good ones. I got the Adirondack for today. So this is the kind, I'll buy this one or any of the others. I don't usually use the Aldens for this, but a little bit of a richer ice cream. And now I'm gonna cut it. So it's pretty cooled off. I don't want to cut it when it's hot. It'll make a big mess.
Would it become watery if you cut it too soon? Is that what happens?
It just needs time to cool down and set. This one's pretty cool. It's also, just so you know, it's not gonna make like the most perfect piece. It's just not that kind of pie. But you see, it's gonna come out.
It looks so good. Everyone's commenting on how amazing that looks.
And then put some vanilla ice cream next to, I don't like to complicate the top with the ice cream. And there it is.
Thank you, Alana. That looks absolutely incredible. I'm just
I
sad
wish I could share it with everybody on the call.
us too.
I'm gonna try, I've never done this before. I've done it with apple pies, but I'm gonna try freezing this one unbaked because I think it may work to bake out of the freezer like that. So I'll let you know.
Thank you.
Anybody else have questions?
No, we've been asking them throughout the session and you've had great answers. Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Okay.
Oh, so somebody's asking, how about frozen berries?
You could use frozen berries. I don't love making pies with frozen berries because I just feel like pies they take some effort and I want the fruit to be the best, but you can use frozen berries for sure.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have our next class. We're going to skip the month of August because many people will be traveling. And so we will have our next class in September. So please tune in to our website to see when our next class is. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.